Welcome to Whispers of Time. Tonight we are going to walk through one of the most fascinating and practical mysteries in human history. We are going to explore how Native Americans slept peacefully and safely in tipis through some of the harshest winters on Earth. And by the end of our time together, you will understand not just how they did it, but why it matters. Why this knowledge, refined over centuries, offers lessons that still resonate today. But before we dive into the solution, we need to understand the problem. We need to feel the danger. We need to grasp why this story is so remarkable. Imagine dying in your sleep, not dramatically, not with pain or struggle, but slowly, quietly, your body temperature dropping degree by degree as the night deepens. Your fingers and toes going numb first. Your thinking becoming confused, your breathing slowing, and then, sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, simply stopping. This is how people died on the Great Plains in winter. This is what hypothermia looks like when it steals someone away in the night. And for centuries, for literally thousands of winters, indigenous peoples of North America faced this exact threat. Every single night from November through March, every night when the temperature plummeted to 20, 30, 50 degrees below zero. Every night when the wind screamed across open prairie at 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. Yet they survived. Not just survived, thrived. Their children grew up healthy. Their elders lived to old age. Their communities persisted, generation after generation, through conditions that would kill most of us within hours. How? This is the mystery that has confounded modern people for generations. How did Native Americans, living in simple tents made of animal hides and wooden poles, survive the most brutal winters on the continent? How did they sleep peacefully through nights that would make modern people panic? How did they keep their newborns alive when a single hour of exposure could be fatal? The answer is not what you might think. It is not about superhuman endurance or genetic adaptation. It is not about toughness or some kind of ancient secret that has been lost to time. The answer is something far more interesting. The answer is a system, a complete, sophisticated, beautifully engineered system of survival that combined understanding of heat, of materials, of human physiology, of wind, of fire. A system that was developed not by a single genius, but by countless ordinary people across hundreds of years, each generation refining what the last generation learned. And here is what makes this story so compelling. You could build this system yourself, right now, with the materials you could find or make. The physics that made it work then still works now. The principles that kept Plains families warm in 1850 would keep you warm in a winter night today. But before we get to the practical answers, before we talk about the construction of the tipi, the management of fire, the layering of insulation, we need to understand the stakes. We need to feel the danger that these people faced every single winter night. Listen for a moment to the wind outside, that low, persistent moan across the frozen prairie. That sound you hear in your mind, not quite a whistle, not quite a howl, cutting through everything, through cloth, through blankets, through the walls of modern homes. The wind of a Great Plains winter is not gentle. It is not passive. It is an active force, a presence, searching for every opening, every crack, every moment of vulnerability. Picture yourself standing outside right now. It is January. It is somewhere in present-day South Dakota, or Montana, or Wyoming. The sky is clear and impossibly cold. The stars are so bright they almost hurt to look at. And the wind has teeth. Exposed skin begins to freeze almost immediately. Your lungs burn when you breathe. Your eyes water and the tears freeze on your face. This is not hyperbole. This is not exaggeration. This is the actual condition of a Great Plains winter night. This is what the indigenous peoples of this region faced not occasionally but regularly, repeatedly for 6 months out of every year. And inside a cone-shaped tent made of buffalo hides and wooden poles, a structure that looks impossibly fragile from the outside, almost like it could blow away with a strong gust. A family sleeps, not fitfully, not huddled in desperation, shivering through the night, praying for dawn, but deeply, peacefully, their bodies warm enough to rest, their minds undisturbed by the terror of the cold. Children are dreaming actual dreams, the kind of dreams that mean deep, restful sleep. Elders are breathing slowly, their chests rising and falling in the rhythm of genuine sleep, the kind of sleep that heals and restores. And the temperature inside, despite the frozen world beyond the thin walls, based on contemporary accounts and the observations of those who have practiced traditional tipi heating, would likely maintain a temperature substantially warmer than the outside air, somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, perhaps higher near the fire, perhaps colder in the outer sections, but warm enough for genuine rest, safe enough to survive, and more than that, to live. This is the mystery, this is the puzzle that we are going to solve tonight. How did they do this? How did the Lakota, the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Sioux, the Arapaho, how did all the great nations of the plains transform a simple cone of hides and poles into a fortress against one of the most hostile environments on the continent? How did they not just survive, but maintain comfort? How did they keep babies alive? How did they allow elders to sleep peacefully? How did they manage, night after night, in conditions that modern people would consider unbearable? The answer is not magic. It is not mystical. Knowledge passed down from ancient shamans. It is not supernatural ability. The answer is something far more profound and far more interesting. It is understanding. Understanding of materials, of physics, of the human body, of the landscape itself. Understanding accumulated over centuries, refined through countless winters, tested against the harshest conditions the earth can create. This understanding is encoded in the way they built tipis, in the direction they oriented the door, in the materials they chose for floors and bedding, in the way they managed the fire, in the layers of clothing they wore while sleeping, in the way they selected campsites, in the way they positioned their bodies to maintain warmth. Every single detail mattered. Every single choice was made for a reason. And when you understand those reasons, when you understand the physics and the biology and the engineering that went into this system, something remarkable happens. You realize that human beings, when they pay attention, when they observe closely, when they are given time across generations to refine their approach, are capable of solving almost any problem. The story of how Native Americans slept warm in tipis without freezing is a story about ingenuity, but it is more importantly a story about observation. It is about paying attention to how heat moves through space, how wind behaves, how the body retains warmth, how materials can be layered to create insulation, how fire can be controlled to provide heat without creating danger, how the landscape can be read to find shelter. The Lakota did not have chemistry textbooks. The Blackfeet did not have engineering degrees. The Cheyenne did not have modern thermometers or instruments to measure heat loss. But they had something perhaps more valuable. They had the necessity to solve a problem, and they had time. Across generations, they had time to observe, to experiment, to refine, to pass on knowledge, to learn from mistakes. And tonight, as you settle in, we are going to walk through that solution, one element at a time. We will start with the ground beneath the tipi and work our way up. We will talk about the materials they used, the buffalo hides, the grass, the animal furs. We will understand how the fire worked, how the smoke moved through space, how drafts could be controlled to create warmth instead of allowing it to escape. We will learn about the linings, about the strategic arrangement of bodies for maximum warmth retention. We will talk about clothing, about the layers worn even while sleeping. We will explore the deeper knowledge, how to choose a campsite, how to orient the tipi to protect against wind, how to read the landscape to find shelter. We will also talk about vulnerability, about how children and elders were cared for in this system, about how mothers manage infants in extreme cold, about how communities adapted to help the most vulnerable members survive. By the end of our time together, you will understand that sleeping warm in a teepee during a plains winter was not miraculous. It was not luck. It was rational. It was systematic. It was the result of a deep, practical understanding of how the world works. And perhaps, in understanding how they did it, we might gain something else, a sense of what human ingenuity is capable of when necessity demands it, when observation is valued, and when generations are given the time to perfect their craft. So, let us begin. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine the cold outside, that merciless wind, that brutal temperature, that hostile environment. And then, imagine the warmth within. Imagine lying in a well-insulated bed, surrounded by family, warmed by a carefully managed fire, protected by layers of material and understanding. And let us journey together into the world of the tipi, the fire, and the careful science of staying warm in one of the harshest environments on Earth. This is not just history. This is not just an old story. This is the story of human capability. This is the story of what we are capable of when we pay attention. Before we talk about the tipi itself, before we discuss the hide covering and the wooden poles and the fire burning at the center, we need to talk about something that most people overlook entirely. We need to talk about the earth beneath the teepee. Because one of the most insidious thieves of body heat is not the air, it is the ground. Cold earth pulls warmth from any living thing placed upon it. If you lie on frozen soil, your body heat drains away like water from a cracked cup, flowing down into the permafrost with a kind of terrible efficiency. This is a process called conduction, and it operates according to simple physical laws. Heat always flows from a warm object to a colder object. The larger the temperature difference between your body and the ground, the faster the heat flows. The more direct the contact between your warm body and the cold earth, the more efficient the transfer of heat away from you. The Plains Indians understood this at a level that was almost instinctive. They had learned through countless nights of experience, through winters that tested them to the limits of human endurance, that the difference between a comfortable sleep and a night of dangerous heat loss began before the teepee was even erected. It began on the ground itself. The first step was selecting where the tipi would be positioned. This was not random. The choice of ground was strategic, studied, intentional. When a Lakota or Blackfeet family arrived at a potential winter camp, the women, who were the builders and owners of teepees among most plains tribes, a fact confirmed by extensive historical accounts, would look for specific features. They were reading the landscape, understanding what it could tell them about wind patterns, moisture, potential shelter from natural features. The ideal winter campsite had certain characteristics. If possible, it was situated near tree lines or rock formations that could serve as windbreaks. The prevailing winds on the western plains came from the west or southwest. By understanding wind direction and local geography, a teepee positioned to have a natural barrier between it and those winds would benefit from that barrier. A bluff, a rise of land, a dense thicket of cottonwoods or pine, these were treasures. They were not just shelter. They were the first layer of insulation, environmental rather than manufactured. When the site was chosen, the preparation began. The ground itself was sometimes modified. Women would scrape away surface soil, removing the topmost layer that was loosest and most porous, and then pack the remaining earth beneath it, creating a denser, more compacted floor. This seemingly simple act had profound consequences for warmth retention. Compacted earth, being denser and more uniform, does not pull warmth from the body as aggressively as loose, porous soil does. The heat transfer is reduced. More importantly, compacted earth has what engineers call thermal mass. During the day, when the sun was shining, Even weak winter sun on the Great Plains can provide some warmth. The ground would absorb some of that heat, storing it in the density of the soil. At night, it would release that heat slowly back into the tipi, contributing to the warmth inside. It was not much, perhaps not even measurable in degrees, but in a situation where every fraction of a degree of warmth mattered, where survival was sometimes measured in tenths of degrees, it was significant. On top of this compacted earth, the real insulation began. The plains peoples used what was available to them. And on the plains, that meant grass. Great quantities of dried grass, the same grasses that covered the prairie in summer and autumn, harvested and dried during the warmer months. Women would gather this grass, sometimes storing it in bundles specifically for use as tipi insulation. When it was time to prepare a tipi for winter, this dried prairie grass was spread across the floor in layers, sometimes quite thick layers, creating a springy cushion base that served multiple purposes simultaneously. First, the grass trapped air. The architecture of dried grass, the spaces between the individual blades, the hollow stems, the complex structure that had evolved over millennia to help the grass survive on the prairie, created tiny pockets of still air. Air, when it is still and not moving, is an excellent insulator. This is the same principle that makes down insulation work. This is why foam insulation is effective. The pockets of air do not conduct heat well. They trap it. In a way, sleeping on grass was similar to sleeping on modern foam padding or down, except that the source was entirely natural, entirely available, and entirely free. The thickness of grass used was substantial, not a thin layer, but a real base. In many cases, it could be 4 to 6 inches deep, sometimes more in particularly harsh winters, or for families with young children or elders. Imagine that kind of cushion between your body and the frozen earth. It makes an immediate difference. Your body heat, radiating downward, encounters this thick layer of trapped air before it reaches the cold ground. The grass absorbs some of that heat, stores it temporarily, and radiates some of it back toward you. You are creating a thermal buffer, a protective zone between your warm body and the cold earth. The second benefit of the grass was thermal separation. Your body heat was not being conducted directly into the cold ground. There was a buffer, a substantial one. The thickness of that buffer determined how effectively your warmth was protected. The physics is straightforward. The more insulation between a warm object and a cold surface, the slower the heat transfer. The plains peoples did not know calculus or thermodynamics, did not have equations to calculate the rate of heat transfer, but they knew this experientially. More grass meant more warmth retention. A person who had slept on inadequate grass insulation knew the difference when they experienced adequate insulation. Their body would be warmer, they would sleep better, they would wake less often, and in winter, these small improvements accumulated. They determined whether a winter was endured with reasonable comfort or suffered through with constant cold. The third function of the grass, and this is often overlooked by people learning about tipi life, was moisture management. Moisture is one of the enemy's many faces in a winter environment. When bodies sleep, they perspire, even in cold weather. The body is not aware that it is cold. The body is generating heat, and some of that heat escapes through perspiration even when the air temperature is well below freezing. When people spend time near a fire, that fire creates moisture, sending it up as steam and smoke into the air. If that moisture condenses on the ground or on the bedding or on the body, it becomes a serious problem. It creates dampness, which accelerates heat loss dramatically. Damp clothing or bedding loses its insulating properties far more rapidly than dry materials do. A person sleeping on damp grass or wrapped in damp furs would lose heat far more quickly than someone with dry materials around them. The grass, with its natural structure and the air trapped within it, allowed some of that moisture to wick away, to be moved away through air currents rather than absorbed into the bedding itself. The grass became a buffer, not just for heat, but for moisture as well. It created a semi-permeable interface, allowing some moisture to escape while still providing insulation. This understanding, based on what we can infer from historical practices and what modern experience with natural materials confirms, was part of the sophisticated knowledge system that sustained Plains peoples through winter. On top of this, thick layer of grass, more materials were added. Buffalo hides were arranged, fur facing inward toward the sleeping people. These hides, the same material that covered the tipi's exterior, had extraordinary properties. Buffalo fur is remarkably dense and long, much longer than the fur of most other animals. A single hide from a buffalo's back, when properly prepared, could be 3 to 4 inches thick when the fur is fluffed up and allowed to reach its full insulating potential. The hollow hairs trapped air just as effectively as the grass did, but in a different way, a more structured way. The hide also had weight and presence. You could feel it. And that psychological sense of being covered by substantial material contributes to a sense of security and warmth, even beyond the actual thermal properties. The orientation of these hides mattered immensely, and this reveals the detailed knowledge that went into tipi life. Fur side facing inward meant that the heat your body radiated would be trapped by the fur, by the complex maze of hair that conducted warmth into itself and radiated it back toward you. Leather side facing outward meant that the outside of your bedding would repel moisture and any drafts that managed to find their way through the tipi walls. It was a careful orchestration of layering, each layer chosen for its specific properties, its specific contribution to the overall system of warmth retention. Nothing was left to chance or to casual placement. On particularly cold nights, and on the Great Plains, particularly cold nights happened regularly from November through March. Additional layers would be added to this base system. More hides would be brought out and arranged on top of the sleeping people. More furs would be added to the sleeping area. Wolf skin, elk skin, deer skin, depending on what the family had available and what they had obtained through hunting or trade. Some of these skins were particularly prized for their insulating properties. Caribou hides, when they could be obtained through trade relationships with peoples further north, the Inuit peoples of the far north, or the northern Canadian tribes who had access to caribou herds, were especially valued because of a unique property. Caribou fur has individual hairs that are hollow. This creates an unusual amount of airspace within the fur, making caribou fur extraordinarily insulating, while being relatively light compared to other animal furs. Families that had access to caribou hides, either through their own hunting expeditions north or through trading relationships, would add these to their sleeping arrangements during the harshest winter periods. A person wrapped in caribou fur experienced a level of warmth and lightness that was difficult to achieve with any other material available on the plains. For the youngest members of the family, infants and toddlers, additional considerations were made. And here we see the community values expressed in practical form. Children lose heat more rapidly than adults for several reasons. First, their smaller mass means less total body heat generation. A large adult generates more metabolic heat than a small child. Second, their surface area to volume ratio is larger, meaning they lose heat more rapidly through the surface of their skin. Third, their ability to thermoregulate, to control their own body temperature in response to environmental challenges, is not yet fully developed. An infant cannot shiver to generate heat as effectively as an older child. An infant's body is still developing its temperature regulation systems. So, children, especially very young children, were placed in the warmest, most carefully insulated sections of the tipi. Often this was directly adjacent to the central fire pit, where the radiant heat from the flames was most direct. But placement too close to the fire created a different danger, the danger of burns. So the placement was carefully calculated, close enough to benefit from the radiant warmth, far enough away to avoid the direct heat and the flames. The bedding around these children would be exceptionally thick, exceptionally well insulated. Additional heated stones, which we will discuss more thoroughly when we talk about fire management, would be placed nearby, warming as the fire burned, and then slowly releasing that heat throughout the night. Elders receive similar consideration. As people age, their ability to generate body heat diminishes, their metabolic rate slows. Their circulation becomes less efficient, meaning that blood reaches the extremities more slowly and carries less warmth. They are more vulnerable to hypothermia, more susceptible to the infiltration of cold that happens when body temperature drops below the point where normal thermoregulation can maintain it. Elderly community members were often positioned in the warmest parts of the teepee, their beds arranged so they would receive maximum benefit from the fire and from the insulation carefully arranged around them. In a teepee, there was no hierarchy of comfort that placed younger, stronger people in preference to the vulnerable. The logic was collective survival. The young and strong would benefit from whatever marginal discomfort the cooler zones of the teepee offered because they had the metabolic capacity to handle it. Their bodies could generate more heat. Their circulation was more efficient. Their ability to adjust their position and their clothing to manage their temperature was better developed. The young and old, the vulnerable members of the community, received the warm center because they could not otherwise maintain their body temperature in the harsh winter environment. This was not charity, it was practical survival logic, and it reflects a sophisticated understanding of differential vulnerability and community responsibility. This foundation work, the selection and preparation of the ground, the gathering and arrangement of grass and hides, the strategic placement of sleeping areas, and the assignment of the warmest locations to the most vulnerable community members. All of this happened before the fire was lit, before the smoke began to rise, before the system of tipi heating truly came into effect. It was foundational work, and it was as crucial to survival as any other element of tipi life. Heat and smoke management. In the center of the tipi, on the carefully prepared and insulated ground, there was fire. Not a large fire. Plains wood was scarce, particularly in the open prairie areas where trees were few and far between, and fuel had to be managed carefully, but a fire nonetheless. Usually this was a relatively modest fire, perhaps 2 or 3 feet in diameter at the base, carefully tended and fed with whatever fuel was available. The choice of fuel was strategic and governed by what was available in different regions and seasons. In areas near rivers and water sources where cottonwood trees grew, dried cottonwood would be burned. Cottonwood is not the ideal firewood. It produces less heat than some other woods and creates more smoke than hardwoods do. But it was available and it worked. In some areas, particularly in the northern plains, pine and cedar were available, and these were preferred because they burned hotter and with less smoke. But the most common fuel across much of the Great Plains was dried buffalo dung, called chips by English speakers. Buffalo chips burned remarkably well, hot and steady, though with a distinct smell that became simply part of winter life. A familiar scent that no one remarked upon because it was constant and expected. The central fire served multiple purposes, and understanding those purposes helps explain why the teepee remained warm without becoming unbearably smoky. A problem that many visitors to traditional teepees in early contact periods noted and complained about. Yet the people living in them seemed to manage without distress. The primary purpose was obvious. The fire provided heat. But the specific way it provided heat was important and reveals sophisticated understanding of heat physics. A fire radiates heat in all directions. The flames in the hot coals emit infrared radiation, energy that travels outward in straight lines from the source. Anyone or anything in the direct path of those straight lines receives heat. This is radiant heat, and it is one of the most effective forms of heat transfer in an open space. Unlike convective heat, which depends on air circulation and on warming an entire volume of air, radiant heat does not require the entire volume of the teepee to be heated to room temperature. You could be relatively close to the fire and be warm, while the upper portions of the teepee, nearer the smoke hole, remained much cooler. This was not inefficient. It was exactly the right strategy for a space where people slept on the ground, and where heating the entire volume was unnecessary and wasteful of fuel. For a family sleeping around this central fire, the arrangement meant that everyone in the sleeping circle received radiant warmth. Those closest to the fire received the most. Those sleeping farther back in the tipi received less direct radiant heat. But the key was that everyone in the main sleeping area received some warmth from the flames. As people shifted in their sleep, repositioning themselves during the night, they maintained their placement relative to the radiant heat source. The body, even asleep, is sensitive to comfort and will shift slightly to maintain warmth. This natural repositioning meant that people could maintain comfort throughout the night without consciously thinking about it. The fire also provided a secondary form of heat, convective heat. This is where the sophistication of tipi design becomes truly apparent. The hot air above the fire rises. This is not mysterious. Hot air is less dense than cold air, so it floats upward. As this hot air rose within the tipi, it created a draft. This rising air would encounter the smoke hole at the very top of the tipi's apex and escape. But as that hot air rose, as it moved away from the fire, it created a pressure difference. The air near the fire was being drawn upward and away. This created a vacuum of sorts, a low pressure zone at ground level near the fire. Cooler air from ground level around the tipi surrounding the sleeping areas was drawn toward this low pressure zone to replace the rising hot air. This cooler air, as it passed near the fire and moved upward, was warmed. It rose, heated, and escaped through the smoke hole, creating a continuous cycle. This convection process meant that the air throughout the tipi was, on average, warmer than the outside air. The effect was not dramatic. The entire tipi was not heated uniformly to a comfortable temperature. But the air, circulating through this convective process, was warmer than it would have been in a sealed, dead space. The circulation also helped to distribute the warmth somewhat more evenly and, crucially, helped prevent the stagnation of air that could lead to excessive carbon dioxide accumulation or poor air quality. But the fire also created smoke. And this is where the genius of the tipi design becomes most apparent, because managing the smoke was not a side benefit. It was central to the entire system of heating and ventilation. The smoke from the fire contains heat energy. When you breathe smoke, your lungs absorb some of that heat. When smoke fills a space, that space becomes warmer because the smoke is carrying heat through the volume of the space. But too much smoke makes the environment unbearable. It irritates the eyes, causes them to water. It irritates the throat and the lungs. It can be dangerous if concentrated enough. Excessive smoke can cause respiratory damage and make sleep impossible. Yet, a traditional tipi managed smoke in a way that allowed it to contribute to warmth without overwhelming the inhabitants. This management was one of the most important innovations in tipi design. The secret lay in the smoke flaps. These were two large panels of hide or canvas positioned at the apex of the tipi, one on each side of the smoke hole. These flaps were not fixed in place. They were not static elements of the structure. They could be adjusted using specialized poles dedicated to this purpose, typically two longer poles that extended outside the tipi, each one lashed to a smoke flap. By manipulating these poles from inside the tipi, a person could adjust the angle and position of the smoke flaps, opening or closing the gap, directing the opening of the flaps in different directions. The principle was straightforward but elegant, and it reveals a deep understanding of how air and smoke move. The smoke, being hot and less dense than cool air, naturally wants to rise. The smoke hole at the top of the tipi provides a channel for this escape, but the smoke flaps could be positioned so that the opening faced away from the wind. This was critical to the entire system. If the wind was coming from the west, which it typically did on the plains in winter, the smoke flaps would be positioned so that the opening faced east or slightly north or south, away from the direct wind. This prevented what is called a downdraft, where wind pressure forces smoke and cold air back down into the tipi. Instead, what happened was an updraft. The rising smoke, the rising hot air, moved up the sides of the conical structure toward the apex. The smoke flaps, positioned correctly, allowed this rising air to escape while preventing outside wind from forcing back down into the tipi. It was a valve system, mechanical and elegant and entirely reliant on understanding fluid dynamics, how gases move, how pressure differences drive flow, how to manipulate the shape of openings to control direction of flow. Based on accounts from those who have studied tipi functioning and from contemporary practitioners of traditional tipi heating, the management of these smoke flaps was one of the key skills of someone living in a tipi. An experienced person could look at the fire, feel the air movement, and know instinctively how to position the flaps for maximum efficiency. A person new to tipi life would need to learn this through practice and sometimes through mistakes. A poorly positioned flap, meaning a smoky tipi for part of the night until the adjustment was made. But there was another layer to this ventilation system. Between the outer cover of the tipi and the inner lining, if a lining was used, which it was in winter, a gap existed. Outside air could flow into this gap. The outer cover, being exposed to wind, was pushed inward by wind pressure at various points, forcing air through small openings and into the gap between cover and liner. This air, once in the gap, was warmed slightly, not directly by the fire, but by the warmed air within the tipi, diffusing through the lining. This warmed air in the gap would then flow upward along the slope of the tipi and exit through the smoke flaps at the apex. The rising warm air created an internal draft that complemented and enhanced the rising smoke. This was the chimney effect, and it was carefully engineered, though without modern terminology or explicit theory. The rising hot air and smoke in the center of the tipi, the exhaust path at the top through the properly positioned smoke flaps, the fresh air intake through the base of the tipi, where the cover was not sealed completely to the ground. These created a circulation system. Fresh oxygen was drawn in at the base. The fire consumed this oxygen and burned fuel. Hot gases rose, and these gases were expelled through the flaps at the top. The system was self-sustaining, requiring no moving parts, no electricity, no technology beyond observation and understanding and careful construction. On particularly cold or windy nights, when the fire needed to be burned longer to provide more heat, the smoke flaps might need to be adjusted more frequently. Based on accounts from those who have lived in tipis or studied their functioning, a family member might spend part of the night monitoring these flaps, repositioning them as the wind shifted. This was not seen as a burden, but as a practical necessity. The person managing the smoke flaps was performing a crucial function. They were maintaining the system that kept everyone warm. In many tipi communities, this was often a task that rotated among family members. A person might tend the fire and manage the flaps for several hours. Then, another family member would take over while the first person slept. If the flaps became misaligned, if the wind shifted unexpectedly, the result would be a smoky tipi. This happened. Winter storms could come suddenly. Wind could gust and shift unpredictably. Severe winter weather could make smoke management difficult even for experienced people. In such situations, the goal was always to find the configuration that allowed the maximum amount of heat to remain inside while the smoke was being effectively expelled. It was a balance point, and finding that balance point meant the difference between a warm, relatively pleasant night and a cold, smoky, miserable night. Different tribes had developed slightly different configurations of smoke flaps based on their specific regional conditions. The Lakota Sioux tipi had smoke flaps positioned in a particular way, angled and sized differently from the Cheyenne tipi or the Blackfeet tipi. These were not arbitrary differences or matters of aesthetic preference. They reflected regional wind patterns, local wood availability, and different tribal preferences refined over centuries of winter experience. The Blackfeet, living in the mountainous regions of the northern plains where wind could be particularly fierce and unpredictable, had developed a tipi configuration that was somewhat less vertically tall and more squat in proportion, with smoke flaps that were particularly efficient at rejecting downdrafts. The Crow, living in areas with somewhat different weather patterns and terrain, had developed a tipi with exceptionally long smoke flap poles that provided more control over the vent opening and more flexibility in managing changing wind conditions. The fire itself required management that went beyond simply building it and letting it burn passively. A small, hot fire was preferable to a large, smoldering one. A hot fire meant more complete combustion, which meant less smoke for the same amount of heat output. Efficient combustion produces less harmful particles, less irritation of the eyes and lungs. Wood that was well seasoned, that had been dried for some time, burned hotter and cleaner than wet or fresh wood. The peoples of the plains, particularly those who lived in areas with limited wood, had developed deep knowledge about which woods burned best and how to prepare fuel properly. Pine and cedar, when available, were preferred because they burned hot and relatively cleanly. Cottonwood, which was common along river valleys throughout the plains, burned adequately though, with more smoke and less heat output. Buffalo chips, the dried dung, burned surprisingly well, hot and steady. Interestingly, dried animal manure burns more efficiently than many people would expect, because the plant matter in it, partially digested, combusts readily. Buffalo chips burned with distinctive characteristics. They produce substantial heat, they burn steadily, and they produce less smoke than fresh wood would, though with a distinct smell that became normalized in teepee life. The fire was usually built inside what might be called a shallow fire pit. Not a deep excavation, but a slight depression in the ground, sometimes ringed with stones to contain the fire and prevent it from spreading toward the bedding or the teepee cover. The stones ringing the fire served multiple purposes. They contained the fire, certainly, but they also absorbed heat from the fire and retained it, becoming hot themselves, almost like coals. As the fire burned down in the evening and night progressed, people might pick these stones up using careful movements or with tongs, often just forked sticks held in hands or made into simple tools, and carry them to the sleeping areas. These heated stones would be placed near beds or wrapped in hides to provide additional warmth as the night progressed. This practice of using heated stones was widespread across plains tribes and served crucial functions. Mothers would heat stones throughout the evening, throughout the time when the fire was burning hot and strong, and then wrap them in soft furs. As night progressed and the family slept, mothers would place these heated stones at the feet of small children, checking throughout the night to ensure the stones remained warm and appropriately positioned. The stones, over the course of hours, would gradually cool, transferring their heat to the person beside them. By morning, they would be at or near room temperature, but they would have done their work through the long hours of darkness, maintaining body heat and preventing the dangerous drop in body temperature that could lead to hypothermia. For an elder or someone who was ill, a heated stone placed near the lower back could provide comfort and warmth as the person slept. The lower back contains the kidneys and large blood vessels. Heat applied to this area warms the blood passing through these vessels, and this warm blood then circulates through the body, raising overall body temperature and helping maintain it. By morning, the stone would be cool, but the person would have benefited from hours of gentle external warmth. For particularly severe cold, when temperatures dropped to levels more extreme than normal, this system would be enhanced dramatically. More stones would be heated throughout the evening. More people would be assigned to monitor the stones, to rotate them, to replace cooled stones with freshly heated ones. In extreme circumstances, a particularly vulnerable person might have multiple stones maintained around them through the entire night. A relay of heat sources ensuring that body temperature did not drop dangerously. Water was sometimes poured onto the heated stones, creating steam. This had multiple benefits. The steam carried more heat energy than dry air, warming the lungs and sinuses of people who breathed it. The moisture in the steam helped prevent the dry air of the teepee from parching throats and nasal passages, conditions that could lead to bleeding and damage during extremely cold weather. The steam also had a psychological benefit. It created a sense of warmth and comfort, a moment of ease in an otherwise harsh environment. the feeling of breathing warm, moist air in the middle of a cold winter night provided not just thermal benefit, but emotional comfort. The linings and layering system. One of the most crucial innovations in tipi design, particularly for winter use, was the addition of the inner lining. This was not a universal feature of all tipis, and it was not used year-round. But when winter came and the temperature plummeted, when the season shifted from autumn to the full harshness of winter, the lining was carefully hung inside the tipi, creating what might be thought of as a tipi within a tipi, a structure within a structure. This was not complicated construction in the sense of requiring special materials or exotic techniques. It was elegant in its simplicity, requiring only careful planning and labor. The liner was typically made of the same type of material as the outer cover, tanned hide, or later in post-contact times, canvas obtained through trade. But it was positioned inside the tipi, suspended from a rope or cord that was strung from pole to pole, usually about head height or slightly higher. The bottom of the lining was carefully folded under and sealed against the ground, creating a seal that prevented air from flowing between the inner and outer covers at the base. The top of the lining did not reach the apex of the tipi. It left a gap, an opening so that the smoke and hot air could still rise through the space between the cover and the lining, traveling upward and eventually escaping through the smoke hole. The effect of this lining was transformative. It created an airspace, a gap between the outer cover and the inner lining. This gap, seemingly simple, had profound consequences for warmth, retention, and comfort. Let us understand what happens inside a simple tipi without a lining during winter. The outer cover is thin, perhaps a quarter-inch of tanned hide or canvas, though some sources suggest it could be thinner or thicker depending on preparation and use. The interior air, warmed by the fire, rises. But it also comes into contact with the inside surface of the cold hide cover. Wherever the warm interior air touches the cold outer surface, heat is lost through conduction and radiation. The hide, being at the outside boundary of the system, is cold because it is in contact with the frozen air outside. It can be no warmer than the outside air, and usually it is almost as cold as the outside air. Inside the tipi, near this cold surface, condensation forms, and this is a crucial point. The warm interior air loses heat to the cold hide. The air temperature at the point of contact drops. Air can hold only a certain amount of water vapor. When the air temperature drops, it can no longer hold all the moisture it contained. Water vapor condenses into liquid, forming droplets, forming frost on the inside of the cover. If the interior surfaces are cold enough, and in severe winter cold, the inner surface of the tipi cover can indeed become very cold. This condensation becomes frost or even ice. Over weeks and months of use, particularly in severe cold, a layer of ice can form on the inside of the tipi cover. This ice accumulation represents a serious loss of the cover's insulating properties and, over time, can damage the hide itself. Now, imagine a tipi with an inner lining. The interior of the tipi is no longer directly exposed to the cold hide cover. Instead, there is a gap, that all-important airspace between the two layers. The outer cover is now in contact with the outside air and is indeed very cold, but the inner lining creates a barrier between the interior living space and this cold outer surface. The inside surface of the lining is warmed by the interior air of the tipi. Condensation that does form, because it will still form on the inside surface of the lining. Condensation is inevitable, drips down the inside of the lining, runs down the sloped surface, and drips onto the ground or into the gap between cover and lining, where it eventually finds its way outside through the base of the tipi, or evaporates from the air gap. SECL. Critical thermal benefit is this. The air gap between the cover and the lining acts as an insulator. Air, when still and not moving, does not conduct heat particularly well. That is why down insulation works so effectively. The feathers trap still air in their structure. That is why foam insulation is valuable. The bubbles in the foam traps still air. The gap between cover and lining traps air that is partially warmed by the heat inside the teepee. This partially warmed air creates a thermal buffer. The inside surface of the lining, being exposed to the warmed interior air, remains warm enough that little heat is lost through it. The cold outer cover is exposed to frigid outside air on its external surface, but it is separated from the living space by this insulating layer of still air and the lining material itself. The insulation value of this system could be further enhanced by adding material into the gap. Grass was sometimes stuffed between the cover and the lining, particularly in very cold weather or in communities with access to abundant dried grass. This dried prairie grass, the same material used on the floor, could be packed into the gap, reducing the amount of airspace and increasing the density of insulation. More grass meant better insulation, but it also meant less air circulation in the gap, which had trade-offs. A certain amount of air circulation in the gap was useful because it allowed moisture that had condensed on the outer cover to eventually evaporate and escape. Too much grass, and the moisture would accumulate, potentially making the outer cover damp from the inside, which could reduce its insulating properties and its ability to shed water from rain or snow outside. The lining itself sometimes had holes in it, particularly if it was very old or heavily used. Based on what we know of Hayde materials and their durability, these holes were not necessarily catastrophic problems. They allowed for some airflow between the living space and the gap, maintaining the circulation that prevented excessive moisture accumulation. Families with old linings might use them anyway because even a partially damaged lining provided benefit. Or they might repair small holes by patching them with pieces of hide. Besides the thermal properties, the lining had another practical benefit. It created a kind of extended interior floor around the base of the tipi. Bedding and personal items were pushed against the base of the lining, and the lining helped retain warmth around these items. More importantly, the lining created a barrier against drafts. Any air that managed to enter the tipi around the edges of the outer cover, seeping through tiny gaps in the hide or between the hide and the ground, would now encounter the lining and its seal at the base. The draft would be partially deflected. Some of it would be drawn up into the gap between cover and lining to be eventually exhaled through the smoke flaps, rather than flowing across the sleeping people and stealing their warmth. The construction of the lining was typically done by the women of the family, the same people who built and maintained the tipi itself. The lining would be custom-made to fit the specific tipi, with the length and width carefully calculated to ensure it would seal properly at the ground and would not interfere with the smoke hole opening and the smoke flap system. The lining could be removed and stored away during warmer weather, then retrieved and rehanged when autumn approached and winter threatened. A family might have multiple linings, worn ones being replaced with new ones, old linings being repurposed or recycled for other uses. The materials used for the lining evolved over time and varied by region. In the earlier periods, before contact with Europeans, linings were made from tanned buffalo hides, just like the outer cover. Later, as the fur trade brought access to European goods, some families obtained canvas or wool blankets and used these materials for linings. Canvas was actually superior in many practical ways. It was lighter than hide, it was less likely to rot or develop permanent tears, and it could be secured more easily, because it didn't require the same level of careful stretching that hide did. But traditional hide linings remained in use throughout the 19th century and beyond, because they had proven their worth over centuries of use, and families maintained them out of both practicality and tradition. Beyond the lining system itself, the layering extended to the clothing people wore, even while sleeping. The Plains peoples understood, at a practical level that was born of necessity and experience, that clothing was part of the insulation system. A person sleeping in a tipi wearing multiple layers of clothing, a base layer of skin, then a soft shirt or tunic of thin leather, then a robe or blanket of thicker material, was maintaining an insulating layer around their body continuously, even as they slept. The clothing trapped body heat, preventing it from being lost directly to the surrounding air. This layering of clothing was not random or casual. There was logic to the arrangement of materials, a system as carefully thought out as the tipi's construction itself. A soft hide or fur was worn next to the skin. This material was comfortable, did not irritate sensitive skin, and had the ability to wick away some moisture from perspiration. Over this, a thicker layer, perhaps a leather shirt or robe made from deer or elk hide, provided the main insulation. The leather or fur of this middle layer was chosen for its density and its ability to trap air within its structure. Outer layers, particularly for use during extreme cold, might be wind-resistant. Leather that had been treated to be particularly water and wind-resistant served as a barrier against the harsh environment. The most vulnerable parts of the body received particular attention from those preparing for winter. The extremities, hands, feet, the face, the neck, lose heat disproportionately because they have large surface areas relative to their volume, and because they are farther from the core body, heat loss is accelerated. Hands were wrapped in hide mittens. These mittens were not thin gloves, as a modern person might imagine them. They were substantial structures, multiple layers of hide, with fur or other insulation between the layers. A person wearing these mittens had their hands wrapped in what was essentially a miniature version of the tipi's insulation system. Feet were placed in insulated moccasins that had been carefully constructed and stuffed with dried grass or fur. The moccasin construction was itself a marvel of insulation. Multiple layers of hide, with fur or grass in between, creating an insulating cocoon for the foot. Around the wrists and ankles, additional wrappings of hide or fur would be secured. These were not merely decorative or protective from injury. They provided insulation at the points where large blood vessels ran close to the surface of the skin. These arteries and veins carry blood to and from the extremities, and if they were allowed to lose too much heat, the blood passing through them would be chilled. This cold blood would then circulate to the core of the body, lowering core body temperature. By wrapping the ankles and wrists, the large blood vessels were protected, and body temperature was maintained more effectively throughout the body. The head and face received particular protection. Hats or head coverings made from fur were worn, not merely during waking hours, but often worn to sleep as well. These were not merely decorative. They covered the head, which is a major source of heat loss for the body. A large portion of the body's surface area is concentrated in the head and neck, and blood vessels in the scalp are close to the surface. A person losing heat through their head was losing heat very efficiently. Modern medical science confirms this principle. In cold environments, uncovered heads lose heat much more rapidly than covered heads. Covering the head with a fur hat dramatically reduced this heat loss. The face presented a more complex problem for those living in winter tipis. The face needs to be exposed enough to breathe, to see, to function. But exposed facial skin loses heat rapidly and is extremely vulnerable to freezing, to frostbite, the damage caused by the actual freezing of tissues. Frostbite typically begins on exposed areas like the face, the ears, the nose, the cheeks. People sleeping in tipis during extreme cold would sometimes wrap portions of the face with hide or fur, leaving only the eyes, nose, and mouth exposed for breathing. This was not done constantly, but was practiced during the most severe cold periods, when the danger of frostbite was acute. Some individuals, particularly those who spent significant time outside during winter, hunters, people gathering water, or fuel, might apply substances to exposed skin to protect it. Animal grease, rendered fat from buffalo, elk, or other animals, would be applied to the face and other exposed areas. This created a protective coating that helped retain moisture in the skin and provided some insulation. It also helped prevent chapping and cracking of the skin, damage that could occur when skin was repeatedly exposed to extreme cold and the drying winter air of the plains, which had remarkably low humidity despite the cold temperatures. The entire system of clothing was designed to work together, creating a protective envelope around the body. The base layer provided comfort and wicked away any moisture from the body's surface, preventing moisture from accumulating and conducting heat away. The middle layer provided insulation, trapping air, and preventing heat loss. The outer layer provided protection against wind and moisture. On top of all this, the bedding, furs and hides carefully arranged, provided additional insulation as the person slept. Remarkably, this system works so well that despite being inside a tipi that might be well below what modern people would consider comfortable, perhaps 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the sleeping areas, or even colder in the outer sections of the tipi, people could sleep in comfort. They might wake occasionally to shift position, to add wood to the fire, to adjust their bedding, or to tend to smoke flaps. But they were not waking constantly from cold. They were not shivering through the entire night. They were sleeping, genuinely resting, their bodies maintained at an adequate temperature despite the hostile environment outside. The knowledge of how to create and maintain this clothing system was crucial to survival. A person who did not understand the principles, who wore inadequate clothing, who left extremities exposed, who did not properly insulate their feet or head, would suffer. People did suffer in severe winters. Frostbite was not unknown. Hypothermia did occur, particularly among very young children, elderly people in poor health, or anyone who became separated from shelter during a storm. But within the tipi, properly clothed and properly bedded, a person could maintain their warmth and their health through even the harshest winter that the Great Plains could produce. Campsite selection and landscape reading. Before any tipi was erected, before any bedding was arranged, before any fire was lit, a crucial decision had already been made. The decision was about where the tipi would be placed. This decision, the selection of campsite and the orientation of the tipi within that site, was perhaps as important as any of the construction or heating innovations we have discussed. Because warmth begins with placement, a poorly positioned tipi, even with perfect linings and perfect fires and perfect bedding, would be harder to keep warm than a well-positioned tipi with merely adequate construction. The physics of heat loss means that shelter from wind is often more valuable than additional insulation, because wind accelerates heat loss so dramatically. The Lakota, the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Crow, all the peoples who lived on the plains and relied on tipis, developed sophisticated understanding of how to read a landscape and choose shelter. This knowledge was not written down in any formal way. It was transmitted from parents to children, from experienced women to younger women, learning the craft of tipi placement and maintenance. It was observation, accumulated over lifetimes and generations, refined through countless winters, tested against the harsh realities of the plains environment. The primary consideration was wind. Wind is the enemy of warmth. Wind moves heat away from objects by increasing the rate of convective heat transfer. A small difference in temperature between an object and surrounding air creates little heat loss. The rate of loss is relatively slow, but when wind blows, air is continuously replaced with new, colder air. The old air that was warmed by your body is blown away. New cold air arrives to take its place. The rate of heat loss accelerates dramatically. A tipi in the open, exposed to wind with nothing to break its force, would lose heat far more rapidly than one sheltered from wind. A difference of 10 or 15 miles per hour in wind speed could mean the difference between comfortable sleep and dangerous cold. The plains wind patterns were understood through generations of observation. The prevailing winds were from the west or southwest. A tipi positioned with a natural windbreak to the west. A line of trees, a rocky outcrop. Even another group of tipis would be partially sheltered. The wind's force would be broken before it reached the structure. This was not random placement based on whim or convenience. Experienced scouts, moving ahead of a main group to select winter camp locations, would be looking for such features. They were reading the landscape like a book, understanding what it was telling them about shelter and protection. Valleys or low points where wind speed was naturally reduced by the geography were prized. A valley running north-south, which would channel winds rather than block them directly, was less desirable than a valley running east-west with hills or cliffs to the west. Areas near tree lines were valuable, places where the land itself created shelter, a depression, a bend in a river with high banks on one side, a cluster of rock formations. These were all noted and considered. The orientation of the tipi within a sheltered location was also strategic and deliberate. The door of the tipi typically faced east toward the rising sun. This was partly practical and partly cultural and spiritual. Practically, facing east meant facing away from the prevailing wind, particularly in winter. If the main opening of the tipi faced into the wind, every time someone entered or exited, blast of cold air would be driven directly into the warm interior. With the entrance facing east, someone leaving in the early morning would be leaving toward the rising sun. The prevailing wind, coming from the west, would pass by the door without pushing directly into it. Only during unusual wind patterns, during storms from unexpected directions, would the door face significantly into the wind, and even then, usually only partially. The placement of tipis relative to each other also created shelter through community arrangement. A winter camp was not a haphazard scattering of structures placed randomly across the landscape. It was arranged with intention and understanding. Family groups positioned their tipis relatively close to one another, not touching, but near enough that the grouping provided mutual protection from wind. The tipis, standing in a loose circle or cluster, or sometimes in a more linear arrangement, created a barrier for one another. The wind hitting the outer tipis was partially deflected and slowed before reaching the interior tipis. The inner tipis sat in a relative pocket of calmer air, experiencing less wind stress and therefore losing less heat. This principle was taken further in severe weather. During particularly brutal winter storms, when temperatures dropped to dangerous levels and wind reached dangerous speeds, a camp might consolidate even more. Multiple families might move their tipis even closer together, creating an even more protected inner core. In the most extreme circumstances, smaller tipis might be positioned so that they were practically touching, creating a solid barrier against the storm. This was not a permanent arrangement, it was temporary, lasting only as long as the worst of the weather. But it demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of how collective shelter could be managed and how the group could adapt its arrangement to respond to changing environmental conditions. Water was another major consideration in campsite selection. A winter camp needed reliable access to water, despite the cold. Ice could be broken, and in extreme cold, ice could be melted by heating, but the source had to be available. Rivers were preferred because they remained flowing even in harsh winter, the moving water refusing to freeze completely in most cases. A camp positioned near a river had a constant source of liquid water. Tree lines along rivers also provided wind protection and a supply of wood or other fuel for fires. This made river valleys the prime location for winter camps across the plains. The Lakota, the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Crow, all these peoples, when possible, positioned their winter camps in the sheltered valleys of major rivers: the Missouri, the Platte, the Arkansas, the Powder River, the Yellowstone. These valleys offered multiple benefits simultaneously: protection from wind, water access, and usually trees or shrubs for fuel, plus the benefit of the earth itself holding some heat. The topography itself was read like a text, like a language that experienced observers could interpret. A hillside with the correct slope could channel wind upward, reducing wind speed at ground level where the tipis sat. A natural depression or hollow in the land created a pocket of shelter, like a cupped hand protecting a flame. A line of hills to the west blocked wind. Even the orientation of ridges and valleys mattered. North-south running valleys offered more protection from east-west moving wind than valleys that ran east-west. An experienced observer, looking at a landscape for the first time, could make predictions about wind patterns and shelter based on the landforms they saw. Experienced women who were skilled in reading landscapes were valuable members of the community. They would be consulted by the headmen when a camp was being established. Their knowledge of local geography, knowledge gained over decades of living in a region, Their understanding of which locations had sheltered the band well in previous years, their ability to predict how weather would interact with a particular landscape, these were crucial skills. An error in campsite selection could have grave consequences. Choosing a location that seemed adequate in mild weather, but was exposed to wind during a storm, could mean loss of life, particularly for the vulnerable members of the community. The season also influenced location choice. A site that was excellent for summer use, with good grazing for horses nearby, with open space for children to play, with water access, might be terrible for winter. A site that sheltered the band during autumn storms might lack adequate fuel supplies. The winter camp was typically established in September or early October, timed to be in place before the worst weather arrived. The location would be chosen specifically for winter conditions, with wind protection and fuel availability as primary considerations. Once a camp was established, certain locations within the camp were preferred for families with young children or with elders. The most protected spots, deep within the camp, surrounded by other tipis, backed against the best natural windbreaks. These were reserved for the most vulnerable members of the community. Young warriors and strong hunters, those who could most easily survive in marginal conditions, might position their tipis on the periphery, serving as a kind of protective ring around the more vulnerable population. The camp would typically remain in one location for extended periods, weeks or even months. A winter camp established in November might not be broken down and moved until late February or March, when the worst of the winter was past, and the season began to shift towards spring. This extended occupation meant that the site would be carefully maintained. Worn ground would be avoided for sleeping areas. Adequate firewood supply would be established and managed. Waste disposal areas would be maintained at a distance from where people lived and slept. The camp took on a semi-permanent character, more structured and organized than a temporary summer hunting camp. The most successful winter camps were places that had been used year after year, sometimes for generations. These traditional winter camp locations were known to multiple bands and sometimes shared peacefully or managed according to established protocols. The location would have proven itself. It had provided shelter during difficult winters in the past. It had adequate resources. It had been assessed and approved by the collective experience of the community. There was no formal tenure or ownership in the modern sense, but there was recognition that this place was where your band wintered, and it was known to be reliable. Beyond the structure itself, beyond the fire, beyond the arrangement of bedding and linings, there was the body itself. The human body is a heat engine, constantly generating warmth through metabolic processes. A living person at rest produces approximately 100 watts of heat, that is, heat equal to the power consumption of a bright light bulb. During sleep, this heat production drops slightly, but it remains substantial. The challenge is retaining this heat, preventing it from escaping into the environment. The peoples of the plains understood, intuitively and through experience, that clothing was part of this system. Clothing was not worn merely during waking hours and removed for sleep, as if the body's need for thermal protection ended when consciousness ended. Clothing was worn through the night, layered strategically to create an insulating cocoon around the sleeping person. The base layer, worn directly against the skin, was typically made from soft, tanned hide. This might be a simple garment, essentially a shirt of thin leather with openings for arms and neck. The hide would have been prepared with particular care, tanned with oils that made it soft and supple. The softness was important not just for comfort, but for practical reasons. A rough texture against the skin could cause irritation, particularly on the inner arms and inner thighs where the skin is most sensitive and most prone to chafing. Irritation could lead to chafing, which in turn could lead to breaks in the skin. In a harsh winter environment, a break in the skin could lead to infection. An infection in a body already stressed by cold and hardship could become serious. Alternatively, the base layer might be made from woven plant fibers, or, among some groups that had access through trade, from plant-derived textiles. But soft hide remained the most common and the most valued for its combination of warmth, comfort, and durability. Over this base layer came the main insulating garment. This was typically a robe made from heavier hide or fur. The ideal material was animal fur. Buffalo, elk, deer, bear, wolf, depending on what was available and what the family had obtained. Through hunting or trade, buffalo fur, the same material used for tipis, was prized. A buffalo robe made from hide with the fur still intact was an excellent insulator. The fur trapped air in its complex structure, and the density of buffalo fur meant that a relatively thin robe provided substantial insulation. A single buffalo robe could provide as much insulation as multiple layers of thin materials. The construction of these robes was sophisticated. The hides were carefully selected. Certain parts of the animal's body provided better insulation than others. The back and sides of an animal, particularly a buffalo, had the thickest, densest fur. The belly and legs had thinner fur. Experienced hide workers knew which parts of the hide to use for maximum insulating value. Multiple hides might be sewn together to create a garment large enough to wrap around a person's entire body, with the furs arranged so that all the insulation faced inward toward the body. The robe might be secured with sinew ties or, later, with strings or laces, but it was not typically sewn completely closed. It was more like a large blanket or cape that could be wrapped around the body, with the arrangement of how it was worn depending on the activity and the weather. During sleep, the robe would be arranged to cover the entire body from shoulders to feet, secured in place by the person's weight and position, and held in place by the friction between the sleeping person and the bedding beneath them. The extremities received particular attention from those preparing for winter. Hands were wrapped in mittens made from fur-lined hide. These mittens were not thin gloves, as a modern person might imagine them. They were substantial structures, multiple layers of hide, with fur or other insulation between the layers. Creating an insulating structure that still allowed some hand function for tasks was a challenge, but families had solved it through generations of experience. A person wearing these mittens had their hands wrapped in what was essentially a miniature version of the tipi's insulation system. Feet were treated with even more care because feet were crucial to survival. If your feet froze or suffered severe frostbite, your ability to walk, to hunt, to gather, to escape from danger was compromised. Feet were placed in insulated moccasins that had been carefully constructed and stuffed with dried grass or fur. The moccasin construction was itself a marvel of insulation. Multiple layers of hide, with fur or grass in between, creating an insulating cocoon for the foot. The sole would be thick and durable. The upper part would be carefully constructed to allow the foot to move slightly while still providing insulation. The most effective winter moccasins had fur lining, with the fur facing inward so that the hair was against the skin of the foot. The person would place their foot inside this fur-lined moccasin, and their skin would be surrounded by insulation. The dense hair of the fur would trap air, and the entire structure would create a warm environment for the foot, preventing heat loss even during extended cold exposure. A person wearing well-constructed, properly insulated winter moccasins could maintain adequate foot temperature and comfort even in extreme cold. Women made these moccasins with tremendous care and attention to detail. A pair of winter moccasins was a prized possession and would be carefully maintained. If they became damaged, they would be repaired. If the insulation inside became compressed or degraded with use, the moccasin would be carefully opened, the old insulation removed, and new insulation installed. A good pair of winter moccasins could last multiple winters with proper maintenance, and they were sometimes passed down from mother to daughter or traded to other families. Around the ankles and wrists, additional insulation was applied. Hide wrappings or fur wraps would be secured around these areas, providing extra protection for the blood vessels that ran close to the surface of the skin at these points. These blood vessels carry blood to and from the extremities, and if they were allowed to lose too much heat, the blood passing through them would be chilled. This chilled blood would then circulate to the core of the body, lowering core body temperature. By wrapping the ankles and wrists, the large blood vessels were protected, and body temperature was maintained more effectively throughout the body. The head and face received particular protection. Hats or head coverings made from fur were worn, not merely during waking hours, but often worn to sleep as well, particularly during severe cold. These were not merely decorative. They covered the head, which is a major source of heat loss for the body. A large portion of the body's surface area is concentrated in the head and neck, and blood vessels in the scalp are close to the surface of the skin. A person losing heat through their head was losing heat very efficiently. Modern medical science confirms this principle. In cold environments, uncovered heads lose heat much more rapidly than covered heads. Covering the head with a fur hat dramatically reduced this heat loss. The face presented a more complex problem for those living in winter teepees. The face needs to be exposed enough to breathe, to see, to function. But exposed facial skin loses heat rapidly and is extremely vulnerable to freezing, to frostbite, the damage caused by the actual freezing of tissues. Frostbite typically begins on exposed areas like the face, the ears, the nose, the cheeks. People sleeping in tipis during extreme cold would sometimes wrap portions of the face with hide or fur, leaving only the eyes, nose, and mouth exposed for breathing. This was not done constantly, but was practiced during the most severe cold periods when the danger of frostbite was acute. Some individuals, particularly those who spent significant time outside during a winter, hunters, people gathering water or fuel, might apply substances to expose skin to protect it. Animal grease, rendered fat from buffalo, elk, or other animals, would be applied to the face and other exposed areas. This created a protective coating that helped retain moisture in the skin and provided some insulation. It also helped prevent chapping and cracking of the skin, damage that could occur when skin was repeatedly exposed to extreme cold, and the drying winter air of the plains, which had remarkably low humidity despite the cold temperatures. The entire system of clothing was designed to work together, creating a protective envelope around the body. The base layer provided comfort and wickered away any moisture from the body's surface, preventing moisture from accumulating and conducting heat away from the body. The middle layer provided insulation, trapping air, and preventing heat loss. The outer layer provided protection against wind and moisture, creating a barrier against the external environment. On top of all this, the bedding, furs, and hides carefully arranged provided additional insulation as the person slept. The combined system created multiple layers of thermal protection. Remarkably, this system works so well that despite being inside a tipi that might be well below what modern people would consider comfortable, perhaps 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the main sleeping areas, or even colder in the sections farther from the fire, people could sleep in comfort and safety. They might wake occasionally to shift position, to add wood to the fire, to adjust their bedding, or to tend to smoke flaps if they were the designated fire tender. But they were not waking constantly from cold. They were not shivering through the entire night in desperation. They were sleeping, genuinely resting, their bodies maintained at an adequate temperature despite the hostile environment outside. The knowledge of how to create and maintain this clothing system was crucial to survival. A person who did not understand the principles, who wore inadequate clothing, who left extremities exposed, who did not properly insulate their feet or head, would suffer. People did suffer in severe winters. Frostbite was not unknown. Hypothermia did occur, particularly among very young children, elderly people in poor health, or anyone who became separated from shelter during a storm. But within the tipi, properly clothed and properly bedded, a person could maintain their warmth and their health through even the harshest winter that the Great Plains could produce. There was another crucial element to warmth retention that operated from the inside out: food, and the metabolic processes that converted food into heat and energy. The human body, at rest, generates heat through the oxidation of food, essentially the slow burning of calories to produce energy and warmth. The quantity and type of food consumed had direct effects on how much heat this body could generate. People sleeping in tipis during winter needed to consume adequate calories simply to maintain their body temperature. This was not optional. The additional metabolic demands of staying warm in a cold environment meant that caloric requirements were significantly higher in winter than in summer. A person might need to consume 20, 30, or even more percent additional calories during winter months simply to maintain adequate body temperature. The body, when challenged by cold, increases its metabolic rate, burns calories faster, to generate the heat needed to maintain core body temperature. The Plains peoples understood this, though not through the lens of modern nutrition science with its calculations of kilocalories and macronutrients. They understood it experientially. People needed to eat well in winter, and people who did not eat well would become cold. They would become vulnerable. They would suffer. The preparation for winter began in autumn, during the season of plenty. Buffalo were hunted in greater numbers as autumn approached. Meat was processed and preserved. Berries were dried and stored. Plants were gathered and stored. The goal was to accumulate enough food to sustain the band through the winter months, when hunting would be more difficult and when food sources would be scarce. The staple food in winter was dried meat, buffalo meat that had been prepared in the late fall, cut into strips, and dried in the sun or over low fires. This meat was energy-dense, providing substantial calories in a relatively small volume. When needed during winter, it could be eaten as is, providing a quick source of calories, or it could be used in soups and stews that were simmered over the tipi fire throughout the day and night. The preparation of these stews and soups was partly about flavor and palatability, making food that would be satisfying to eat, but it was also partly about metabolic benefit. When hot food and hot drink were consumed, the body had to expend energy to digest them, to absorb the nutrients. This digestive process, called thermogenesis, generated additional heat. A person consuming a hot stew in the evening would experience not just the calories from the stew itself, but also the metabolic heat generated by the process of digesting that stew. This was particularly important in the evening. A hot meal before sleep would help warm the body and would sustain that warmth through part of the night as digestion proceeded. Bone marrow was another valued food, particularly in winter. Bones were broken and boiled to extract the marrow. This marrow was extraordinarily energy-dense, containing substantial quantities of fat. Fat is the most energy-rich macronutrient, roughly twice as many calories per gram as protein or carbohydrates. Consuming fat meant consuming calories that could be converted to body heat. Rendering fat from bones and storing it was a way of storing concentrated energy for winter use. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, was prepared in the fall and stored for winter. This was not merely food, it was a concentrated package of calories, developed and refined over centuries to provide maximum nutrition in minimum volume. A small quantity of pemmican provided substantial caloric content. It did not spoil easily, it was portable, and it could be eaten without preparation or cooking. For people living through a winter, having adequate supplies of pemmican meant having a reliable source of the calories necessary to maintain body heat and strength. Water consumption was also important, though this was often overlooked by people unfamiliar with cold environments. Dehydration occurs even in cold weather. The cold, dry air of winter causes moisture loss from the respiratory tract and through the skin. If people did not drink enough water, dehydration would result in impaired circulation, reduced heat generation capacity, and increased susceptibility to cold-related injuries. Adequate water consumption was part of staying warm, but the water needed to be warm, or at least not ice cold. Drinking ice water would require the body to expend energy warming that water, energy that could otherwise be used for heat generation. The rhythm of eating in a teepee during winter was different from eating in other seasons. There might not be 3 meals a day of equal size, as modern nutrition advice would suggest. Instead, eating might be more irregular, with people consuming food as they needed it. Someone waking during a cold night might eat something before returning to sleep, using the calories to warm themselves. A person going outside to gather water or gather fuel would eat before going out, building up their internal heat reserves before exposing themselves to the cold. Children required particular attention in this regard. Children have higher metabolic rates than adults. Per pound of body weight, they burn calories faster, but they also have smaller mass and lose heat more rapidly. A child needed to eat frequently to maintain adequate caloric intake and adequate body heat generation. Mothers would ensure that young children had access to food throughout the day and night. A child who was inadequately fed would become cold, would begin to show signs of hypothermia, would be at risk. So children were fed generously during winter, with their food intake receiving priority. A hungry child was a child losing body heat rapidly. Pregnant and nursing women also required special attention. Pregnancy increases metabolic demands. The growing fetus requires nutrients and energy. Lactation, the production of milk, is metabolically expensive, requiring substantial caloric intake. A nursing mother in a cold environment had significant metabolic demands. She needed to consume enough to maintain her own body temperature while also producing the milk necessary to feed her infant. Inadequate nutrition would result in inadequate milk production, putting the infant at risk. Women in their reproductive years during winter were fed well, given access to the richest foods, the fats, the meat, to ensure they could meet both their own needs and those of their infants. The elders might eat differently than others during times of scarcity. If hunting was difficult and food supplies were limited, if a winter was harsher than expected and food stores were running low, elders might eat less, allowing more food to go to children and to those engaged in hunting and other physically demanding activities. This was not about abandoning the elderly. It was about maximizing the survival of the group. But in times of genuine plenty, years when hunting had been successful and food stores were adequate, everyone, including elders, was encouraged to eat well, to maintain their strength and their heat-generating capacity. The act of gathering food during winter, breaking through ice to access water, traveling to food storage areas to retrieve preserved meat, preparing meals over the tipi fire. All these activities kept people physically active to some degree. This activity, even if minimal compared to summer activities, generated heat. The human body responds to mild physical activity with increased heat production. The act of moving around inside the tipi, tending to fires, preparing food, working hides or other materials, this contributed to warmth maintenance through metabolic heat generation. The transition into winter and the transition out of winter were both critical periods that required careful observation and strategic response. They were not abrupt shifts from autumn to winter or from winter to spring, but gradual transformations that required careful observation and strategic response. The knowledge of how to make these transitions successfully was part of the larger knowledge system that sustained Plains peoples through the winter. In late summer and early fall, as the season began to shift, experienced observers would begin watching for signs of the coming winter. The behavior of animals provided clues. Birds beginning their migration southward had suggested that harsher weather would follow. The thickness of an animal's fur could indicate whether the coming winter would be particularly harsh. Certain animals that were normally abundant might become scarce, suggesting that they were moving in response to changing weather patterns. Hunters would report what they observed, and this information would be considered when planning for winter. Plant indicators were observed as well. The timing of seed maturation, the color of leaves as they began to turn, the rate at which vegetation dried. All these provided information about seasonal timing. The first frost of fall was noted carefully. The number of days between the first frost and the onset of winter's hardest cold varied year to year. If the first frost came early, it suggested a long winter. If it came late, it suggested a shorter winter. This information influenced decisions about how much food to preserve, how long the winter camp would need to sustain the band, whether additional hunting should be undertaken. By September, preparations for winter were in full motion. The hunt for buffalo increased in intensity. The hunt was not just about obtaining meat for immediate consumption, but about obtaining the large quantities of meat needed for preservation. A successful buffalo hunt provided meat that could be dried, bones that could be processed for marrow and other uses, hides that could be tanned and used for tipis and clothing, sinew and other materials that would be used throughout the winter. Women were engaged in the labor-intensive process of processing hides and meat. Hides were scraped to remove tissue, tanned using animal brains or other materials, and carefully dried. This was back-breaking work, repetitive and demanding, and it was essential work. The quality of the hides and the clothing and tipi covers produced from them determined how well people would fare in winter. Food was processed and preserved. Meat was cut into strips and dried in the sun or over low fires. Berries were gathered and dried. Plants were gathered and stored. All of this accumulated food was carefully stored, protected from spoilage and from animals. The storage areas were typically outside the main camp, in specially constructed structures that protected the food from weather and from predators. By October, the winter camp had been selected, and preparations were underway to establish it. Tipis were erected in their winter positions. Insulating materials, grass for floors and linings, were gathered and stockpiled. Fuel, wood, and buffalo chips was collected and stored. The camp was set up as if for a long occupation, because it would be. The goal was to be established and ready before the first major winter storm, before conditions became too difficult to work outdoors. The onset of winter itself was marked by observable events. The first significant snow was often the signal that winter had truly arrived. Once snow fell, the landscape changed. Winter activities began. Hunting became more difficult, but sometimes more successful, as animals were easier to track in snow and could not move as rapidly. Travel became more difficult. The camp settled into a winter rhythm with less movement and more time spent in and around the tipis. Through the winter, experienced observers continued to watch for signs. The behavior of animals, the quality of snow, the intensity and direction of wind, the temperature, all provided information. A particularly harsh winter might be preceded by signs that more experienced members of the community recognized. A particularly mild winter might show different characteristics. This ongoing observation was not separate from daily life. It was part of living, part of paying attention to the environment. It was encoded in stories and teachings that elders shared with younger people. The transition out of winter, beginning in late February or March, was also gradual and observed carefully. The angle of the sun began to change. The length of daylight increased noticeably. The temperature, while still cold, began to show signs of warming. Snow began to melt, at least during the warmest parts of the day. Animals began to show different behaviors. Birds that had migrated south began to return. Larger animals became more active. The decision to break camp and move to spring hunting grounds was based on multiple factors. Adequate supplies of preserved food remained, but supplies were beginning to run low. It was time to resume hunting fresh game. The grass on the prairie was beginning to regrow, providing forage for horses. The weather, while still capable of producing storms, was becoming more reliably survivable. This entire cycle, the observation, the preparation, the winter settlement, the transition out, was based on knowledge that was accumulated, preserved, and transmitted across generations. Elders taught younger community members what to look for, how to interpret signs, how to make decisions based on environmental observations. Young women learned from their mothers and aunts how to process hides, how to construct tipis, how to arrange bedding and linings. Young men learned from hunters how to assess the landscape, how to predict where animals might be found in winter, how to position a hunt for maximum success with minimum danger. This knowledge was not written down. It existed in the minds and experience of community members. It was encoded in stories, in teachings, in the examples of those who had lived through many winters. If a community lost too many of its elders, if the transmission of this knowledge was disrupted, the cost could be catastrophic. A band that did not know how to properly construct a tipi with linings, that did not know how to select a winter camp, that did not have adequate preserved food, such a band would suffer terribly in winter and would face increased mortality. Within the warmth of the tipi, certain members of the community were more vulnerable than others. The very young, the very old, and the ill all face challenges in maintaining adequate body temperature. Understanding how these vulnerable populations were cared for tells us much about the sophistication of the heating and living systems within the tipi and the values of the community. Infants and very young children face particular challenges. Their ability to thermoregulate, to control their own body temperature through physiological responses, is less developed than in older children and adults. An infant cannot shiver to generate heat as effectively as an older person can. An infant's body metabolic rate is different from that of an older person, and the infant's surface area to volume ratio means that they lose heat more rapidly per unit of body mass. An infant left in a cold environment would rapidly develop hypothermia, a dangerous drop in core body temperature. The response of Plains peoples to this challenge was multifaceted. Mothers kept infants close to their bodies, using carriers that held the baby against the mother's chest. This body-to-body contact meant that the baby was warmed by the mother's body heat. During sleep, the baby would sleep next to the mother in direct contact, sharing warmth. The mother's body became a heat source for the infant. The clothing of infants and small children was particularly careful and thoughtful. Even very young babies would wear multiple layers of soft hides. The emphasis was on soft materials that would not irritate the baby's skin, but the layers still provided insulation. Infants would be wrapped in furs, with the fur facing inward, creating a cocoon of warmth around the small body. The placement of infants within the tipi was strategic. The warmest spots were reserved for babies, particularly very young babies. An infant might sleep in a cradle board or similar structure that was positioned very close to the central fire, where the radiant heat was most direct, but not so close as to create a danger of burning. This balance, close enough for adequate warmth, but distant enough to avoid burning, required careful attention and constant monitoring. Mothers would spend considerable time managing the warmth around their infants. A baby showing signs of being cold, increased crying, lethargy, pale skin, sluggish movement, would be held closer to the fire. Additional wrappings would be added. A heated stone would be positioned nearby. A baby showing signs of being too warm, rapid breathing, flushed skin, would be moved slightly farther from the fire or given slightly fewer wrappings. This constant monitoring and adjustment was part of motherhood. A woman with infants to care for had significant responsibilities in winter that went beyond simply caring for herself. Elderly people faced different challenges. While they retained the ability to thermoregulate, their metabolic rate often declined with age. They generated less body heat than younger people. Their circulation might be less efficient, meaning that heat generated in the core of the body was less effectively distributed to the periphery. They were more susceptible to cold-related illnesses and to hypothermia. Elderly people were also often provided the warmest sleeping spots. The respected place of honor in the tipi might be less comfortable than the spots directly adjacent to the fire, but during winter, the most comfortable spots, the warmest spots, were often given to elders. This was not merely practical, it was also a reflection of respect and of the community's values. Taking care of elders in winter was understood as a moral obligation, as right behavior. An elderly person who was ill presented particular challenges. Illness in winter was serious. A person with fever would be moved closer to the fire to receive additional warmth. A person with respiratory illness, tuberculosis, pneumonia, or other lung diseases would need special care. These diseases were not unknown among Plains peoples in the pre-contact period, though some became more common after contact with European populations. But even in pre-contact times, respiratory diseases occurred. and they were more serious in winter, when people spent more time indoors in close quarters. Someone with a respiratory illness would need space that was smoky enough to provide warmth and moisture to the lungs, but not so smoky as to be unbearable. The area near the fire provided this balance, with smoke rising around the person, warming and moistening the air they breathed. Hot soups and broths were prepared for the ill person, the heat and moisture helping with breathing and swallowing, and the calories helping maintain body temperature and support immune function. People showing signs of hypothermia, the dangerous lowering of core body temperature, were treated with particular urgency. Early signs of hypothermia include shivering, confusion, and irritability. A person showing these signs would be brought closer to the fire, warmed gradually, provided with warm food and drink. In more severe hypothermia, a person might become unconscious or appear to be barely alive. The traditional response was to gradually warm the person, to provide warmth, to keep them alive through the night. The understanding that even severely hypothermic people could recover if given time and warmth was encoded in these practices. Frostbite, the freezing of exposed skin, was a known risk. Fingers, toes, the nose, the ears were all vulnerable. The traditional treatment for early frostbite included careful warming. If someone came inside with frostbitten fingers, those fingers would be gradually warmed, placed against the skin of another person or in warm water. Rapid warming could cause damage, so the process was done slowly and carefully. Once the tissue had warmed, it would be observed carefully for signs of serious damage or infection. Severe frostbite, where tissue had dyed and turned black or dark purple, was more serious and sometimes required removal of the dead tissue. A person with severe frostbite of multiple fingers or of a foot faced a difficult situation. Losing digits or feet meant losing function, losing the ability to hunt or to perform certain tasks. But living with dead tissue would lead to infection and potentially to death. The decision about whether to remove dead tissue was made carefully, consulting with experienced healers and with the affected person. The knowledge of how to manage these medical conditions was part of the larger knowledge system of Plains peoples. Healers, people who had training and experience in treating illness and injury, were valued members of the community. Their knowledge included understanding of plants used medicinally, understanding of how to treat injuries, understanding of how to manage fevers and infections. In winter, when people spent more time indoors in close quarters, illness spread more readily. The healer's knowledge about preventing spread of disease, about treating symptomatic people, was crucial. Pregnancy and childbirth presented their own challenges in winter. A woman pregnant during winter had increased metabolic demands, and giving birth in winter presented additional challenges. Infants born in winter were born into the harshest environment of the year, but births happened in winter, and communities had developed practices and knowledge to support pregnant women and to help ensure healthy births. A woman pregnant during winter would be given additional food, more opportunity to rest, and reduced expectations for physical labor. The care of a pregnant woman was understood as an investment in the future of the community. When labor began, experienced women would attend the pregnant woman. The tipi provided shelter and warmth for the birth. After birth, the mother and newborn would be kept warm, close to the fire, attended carefully. The system we have been describing, the careful tipi construction, the fire management, the insulation of the ground, the clothing, the food, the careful positioning within the camp, was sophisticated and effective, but it had limits. There were conditions so severe that even this carefully engineered system would be tested to its breaking point. A winter of unusual cold, a winter where temperatures dropped to levels more extreme than normal for the region, could stress the system. A winter where the buffalo were scarce, where hunting was unsuccessful, where food stores became dangerously low, could strain the capacity of the system. A winter where disease spread through the camp, where multiple people were ill simultaneously, could overwhelm the community's ability to care for the vulnerable. The greatest vulnerability was probably when a band became separated from the main camp. a hunting party trapped away from the main camp by sudden weather, a person who became lost while gathering water or gathering fuel. These situations could be life-threatening precisely because the protective system of the tipi, the community, and the accumulated resources of the main camp were no longer available. In such situations, emergency shelter had to be improvised. A person caught out in a severe storm might dig into snow to create a shelter, using their body heat and the insulating properties of the snow to survive the night. Snow is actually an effective insulator because of the air trapped in its structure. A snow shelter, properly constructed, can maintain a temperature significantly above the outside air temperature using only body heat. The knowledge of how to dig and maintain such a shelter was crucial. It could be the difference between survival and death. But the ideal was to never be in such a situation. The prevention of emergencies was easier than responding to them. This is why campsite selection was so important, why the tipi construction was so carefully done, why food stores were accumulated so carefully. The system was designed to prevent emergencies from occurring in the first place. The system also had social and psychological components. The tipi was not just a physical structure providing warmth and shelter. It was also the center of family and community life. Spending long winter nights in the tipi, people told stories, worked on craft projects, socialized. The psychological comfort of being with family, of engaging in meaningful activities, of maintaining social connections and relationships, contributed to the overall well-being and resilience of individuals and of the community. Children growing up in this environment learned the skills and knowledge necessary to survive winter. They watched their mothers construct tipis, work with hides, manage fires. They listened to stories that encoded information about how to behave in emergencies, about how to recognize signs of trouble, about how to support community members in difficulty. By the time they reached adulthood, they had internalized much of the knowledge and skill necessary to manage winter survival. Young women becoming wives and mothers would inherit the tipi from their mothers, or would build their own tipi following the teachings they had received. They would carry forward the knowledge of how to construct, maintain, and heat a tipi. Young men becoming hunters would learn to provide the meat and hides that would be processed into food and materials needed for winter survival. The transmission of knowledge across generations was not formalized or explicit. It was woven into the daily life and the stories and the practices of the community. The system was also adaptive. If the traditional materials became unavailable, if buffalo became scarce, if certain plants disappeared from the territory, alternative materials would be found and used. Canvas, obtained through trade, could be substituted for hide in tipi construction and in linings. Different plant materials could be substituted for traditional plants. Seal oil or other fats could be substituted for traditional insulation materials. The fundamental principles remained the same, even as specific materials changed. The system was also responsive to individual differences. Different families had different resources, different skills, different vulnerabilities. A family with many hunters and many hides available could construct more elaborate tipis with multiple linings and abundant bedding. A family with fewer resources would construct a simpler tipi, would use less elaborate linings. But both could remain adequately warm in winter because the principles were the same: insulation, controlled heat from fire, strategic arrangement of bodies and materials. Despite all this sophistication, winter was still dangerous. People did die in severe winters. Infants died from cold and from illnesses that were exacerbated by the harsh winter conditions. Elders died from cold-related illnesses and from hypothermia. Accidents happened. Someone might fall into water and become dangerously chilled. Someone might become lost and separated from camp. These tragedies were real and were sometimes commemorated in stories and in community memory. But they were the exceptions rather than the rule. Most winters, most people survived. Most people lived through the winter in reasonable health and comfort, maintained by the tipi and the heating systems and the food and the community care. The system was not perfect, but it was effective. It had been refined over centuries to work as well as possible, given the constraints of available materials and the harsh environment. In the latter part of the 19th century, the system we have been describing came under tremendous pressure. The buffalo herds, which had roamed the Great Plains in vast numbers, historical estimates suggest populations between 30 and 60 million animals, were hunted intensively by European and American hunters. Within a few decades, the population had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 animals. Some sources suggest the population dropped even lower, to only a few hundred at the nadir of the decline. Without buffalo, the teepee cover material became scarce. Hide was difficult and expensive to obtain. Without buffalo meat, the primary food source was gone. Without buffalo hides, the clothing and the bedding materials became difficult or impossible to obtain. The entire system of tipi life, which had been built around the abundance of buffalo, collapsed. The United States government, seeking to control the Plains peoples and to force them onto reservations, implemented policies designed to undermine traditional lifeways. Hunting restrictions were imposed. Movement off reservations was forbidden. Children were removed to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages and practicing their cultural traditions. The knowledge systems that sustained winter survival were deliberately attacked and suppressed. People living on reservations with inadequate resources, with restrictions on hunting, with limited access to the traditional materials needed to construct and heat tipis, suffered greatly. Winter deaths increased. Diseases spread more readily in crowded, poorly constructed shelters. The carefully developed systems of staying warm in winter became less available and less effective. And yet, despite all these pressures and restrictions, the knowledge persisted. Families continued to construct teepees when they could obtain materials. People continued to use the principles of insulation and fire management to stay warm in winter. The knowledge was diminished and stressed, but it was not completely lost. It was maintained, protected, and passed down, even under difficult circumstances. In modern times, there has been a significant revival of interest in traditional teepee construction and use. Contemporary practitioners, many of them descendants of Plains peoples, have learned or relearned how to construct traditional tipis. They use traditional materials when available and adapt to modern materials when necessary. They practice the ancient knowledge of how to manage fires, how to create linings, how to sleep warm in a teepee during winter. This revival is not merely nostalgic or historical reenactment. It is partly an assertion of cultural identity, a reclaiming of traditions that were suppressed and nearly lost. But it is also practical. A teepee constructed according to traditional principles is remarkably effective shelter. It uses minimal resources. It requires no electricity, no fuel other than wood or dried dung that can be gathered from nature. In an era of increasing environmental consciousness and interest in sustainable living, the tipi offers lessons about how to create effective shelter with minimal environmental impact. Modern tipi enthusiasts have conducted experiments measuring the internal temperature of traditionally constructed tipis during cold weather. The results confirm what Plains peoples knew from centuries of experience. A properly constructed and heated tipi can maintain an interior temperature substantially warmer than the outside air when the outside temperature is well below freezing. Based on contemporary research and observation, such a tipi can maintain interior temperatures in the range of 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, when the outside temperature is 20 to 30 degrees below zero. This is not tropical warmth, but it is adequate for human survival and even for sleep and rest. The sophistication of traditional tipi design has also been appreciated by engineers and architects studying the structure. The conical shape is aerodynamically efficient, reducing wind resistance and allowing wind to flow around the structure, rather than pushing against it with full force. The smoke hole is an elegant solution to the problem of venting smoke while maintaining heat. The ability to adjust the tipi's thermal properties by adding or removing linings, by adjusting fire intensity, by controlling the smoke flaps represents a kind of thermal engineering that rivals some modern passive heating designs. Contemporary builders have also recognized the efficiency of the system. In an age of rising energy costs and climate change concerns, a structure that can be heated with a small fire and minimal fuel is increasingly appealing. Some modern people have chosen to live in tipis, year-round or for extended periods, demonstrating that the system that served Plains peoples for centuries can work in contemporary contexts as well. The knowledge of tipi construction has been documented in modern times through interviews with elders, through archaeological and ethnographic research, and through practical experimentation. This documentation ensures that the knowledge will not be lost, even if it is not continuously practiced. The tipi, preserved in photographs, documented in books and academic papers, and maintained through active practice by dedicated individuals and communities, has become part of the global heritage of human knowledge about effective shelter design. But perhaps the most important legacy of the tipi heating system is what it represents. A solution to a fundamental human problem developed through close observation of the natural world, through experimentation and refinement across generations, through the careful transmission of knowledge within communities. The tipi represents human ingenuity, deployed not toward conquest or domination, but toward living in harmony with a challenging environment. It represents what is possible when necessity drives innovation, and when generations are given the time to perfect their solutions. As we come to the end of our journey through the tipi, through the innovations and the knowledge systems that allowed Plains peoples to sleep warm and safe in one of North America's most hostile environments, let us sit with the sense of wonder that this should inspire. We have a tendency in modern times to assume that comfort and survival are dependent on modern technology. We assume that we need electricity, furnaces, thermostats, and all the apparatus of modern heating to survive cold winters. We assume that without these technologies, winter would be unbearable. And yet, the Plains peoples, without any of these things, without electricity or fossil fuels, created an environment where they could rest peacefully in the depths of winter. They did this through understanding of materials and their properties, understanding of heat and how it moves through space, understanding of wind and pressure and airflow, understanding of the human body and its needs. This understanding was not written down in textbooks or engineering manuals. It was encoded in practices, in stories, in the daily actions of families building tipis and maintaining fires and arranging bedding. What is perhaps most remarkable is the efficiency of the system. Every element served multiple purposes. The fire provided heat, but it also provided light, a place for cooking, a center for social gathering. The tipi cover provided shelter and insulation, but the material was also used for clothing and for storage containers. The lining provided insulation, but it also managed moisture and protected against drafts. The bedding of grass and furs provided insulation, but grass could be eaten by horses if needed, and furs provided material for clothing and other uses. Nothing was wasted. Everything had multiple purposes. This efficiency reflects a way of thinking about the world that is different from the dominant approach in modern Western culture. Rather than seeking to dominate or transform the environment, the approach was to work with it, to understand its principles, and to live within it sustainably. The materials used for tipis and for heating were renewable or recycled. The system could be maintained indefinitely, generation after generation, without depleting resources. As we face climate change and environmental challenges in the modern world, as we grapple with how to create sustainable human settlements and sustainable ways of living, the tipi and the knowledge systems that sustained it offer lessons. Not lessons that we should literally return to tipi dwelling, though some people do choose to do so, but lessons about how to think about shelter, about how to use resources efficiently, about how to work with rather than against natural principles. The tipi is also a lesson in cultural knowledge and its value. The knowledge of how to build and heat a tipi effectively was not developed by individual geniuses or by elite experts. It was developed collectively, across generations, through countless ordinary people solving practical problems, observing the results, refining their approaches, and passing on the refined knowledge to the next generation. This process is how most human knowledge has actually been developed, despite the modern tendency to attribute discoveries and innovations to individual great men or women. The suppression of this knowledge during the period of colonization and reservation confinement represents not just a cultural loss, but a loss of practical wisdom that could have benefited humanity. We lost access to solutions, to ways of thinking, to approaches to solving problems that had been refined over centuries. The intentional destruction of indigenous knowledge systems was a tragedy not just for indigenous peoples, but for all humanity. The revival of this knowledge in modern times is therefore not just about cultural preservation or cultural pride, though it is those things. It is also about reclaiming practical wisdom that has value for contemporary challenges. As we face the need to develop more sustainable ways of living, as we seek alternatives to energy-intensive heating systems, the tipi offers proven solutions. Tonight, as you settle in for sleep, consider this. Somewhere in North America, someone is sleeping warm in a traditional tipi during a winter night. The outside temperature might be well below zero. Wind might be howling across the frozen plains. But inside, warmed by a carefully managed fire, insulated by strategically layered materials, surrounded by family members, that person is resting in comfort and safety. This is possible not because of advanced technology or vast resources. It is possible because of understanding and ingenuity and the accumulated wisdom of generations. It is possible because human beings, paying careful attention to the world around them, can develop solutions to apparently impossible problems. As you drift towards sleep now, imagine yourself in that warm tipi. Feel the warmth radiating from the fire at your center. Feel the insulation of the grass beneath you, the furs and hides around you. Hear the wind outside, but know that you are sheltered from it. Hear the gentle crackle of the fire, the quiet breathing of family members around you. You are safe. You are warm. You are part of a community that has learned, through generations, how to thrive in a challenging world. The tipi is more than a structure. It is a manifestation of human wisdom, human adaptability, human capacity for ingenuity in the face of challenges. It represents what we are capable of when we pay attention, when we learn from experience, when we work together as communities towards survival and even comfort. Thank you for spending this time with us, traveling back through history, learning about the practical wisdom of Plains peoples. Thank you for considering how their understanding of shelter and warmth might enrich your own understanding of the world. And thank you for allowing us to tell this story to you as you prepare for your own sleep, your own rest, your own comfort in the safety of shelter. If you enjoyed this journey through history, if you found yourself drawn into the world of the tipi and the winter nights of the plains, I invite you to like this video and to subscribe to Whispers of Time. We tell stories from history, stories of how people lived, how they solved problems, how they created meaning in their lives, not with the goal of commanding attention or demanding drama, but with the goal of creating a space where you can relax and learn and drift towards sleep. Each story we tell is carefully researched and thoughtfully narrated, designed to be informative without being taxing, engaging without being jarring. We aim to create a historical sleep journey, a place where you can learn something fascinating about the past, while you're preparing your mind and your body for rest. Subscribe now and join our community of people who are discovering the peace and fascination of historical storytelling. Let us guide you through other worlds, other times, other ways of living. Rest well, sleep peacefully, and know that you are never alone in the darkness. Across time and across the world, human beings have found ways to create warmth, to find safety, to sleep peacefully despite the challenges around them. That capacity is part of our shared human heritage. Good night, sleep well, and we will see you next time on Whispers of Time.